I'm pleased to dive a bit into the subject of cooperation between churches across denominational lines ecumenically. Um, it is largely based on my experiences as a General Secretary of the Churches Commission for Migrants in Europe. As I've said, our membership mainly comprises Orthodox, Anglican, and Protestant churches, but also councils of churches. And I think I will come back to that in a number of countries we have the national councils of churches, and that usually includes the Roman Catholic bishops' conferences, and that we here on Brussels level very, very intensely work together with a number of Roman Catholic organizations. I was spending the morning exchanging a couple of ideas with colleagues from the Jesuit Refugee Service and the Caritas Europa office about a joint paper which we are working on to respond to a proposal of the European Commission about a return policy framework for people who are not allowed to stay in the EU anymore. And as usual, we will do that together. If we look at ecumenical cooperation and networking around across churches, I would say or identify three main areas, and there may be sub areas and there may be additional ones, but for me, there's three main areas. There's first of all the area of diaconia, caritas, the very charitable, very practical work and assisting people who have been displaced, who are migrants, who are otherwise on the move and vulnerable. There's the second one, there's the public witness aspect. And I think we're seeing a lot of that in Europe, of course, but these days predominantly in the US, where a lot of the Catholic bishops' conferences, the different Protestant denominations are along very, very similar line, trying to speak out against the the policy of the government. And as I said, this is something which is the daily bread of my work, trying to build coalitions across denominational lines on policy areas. And I would argue that in these two areas, the more diaconia, charitable, and the more advocacy, public witness oriented area, there's a lot of good cooperation. It's very fruitful and it is comparatively easy, even in areas where church relations are sometimes due to church politics tense, difficult. There's a lot of common ground in these areas of work. We have an additional area, and for me, the jury's still out if that's an area of potential good and excellent cooperation and deepening cooperation, or rather trouble in the making. And that's the more pastoral area. It's the area of church unity. It's the area where we ask, what is migration doing with, for, and in the church in Europe, where we've seen that with people being on the move. In Europe, we very often discuss people from Muslim background countries, but I think for us as the churches is an additional aspect is, what do we do about migrant Christians moving from one area to the other? And that is, of course, a discussion we're having in Europe, but outside. But a lot of the ecumenical geography in Europe, for example, has been shaken a bit and of course, migration of Christians in and to Europe doesn't only happen from within European churches, but let me focus on that for a moment. Traditionally, you could say, and there were, of course, nuances to that, but you could say the south of Europe and parts of the West were Roman Catholic. The northern part was pretty much Protestant. Then you had the British Isles, that was Anglican, and you had Orthodoxy to the east. Of course, there were always minority group, but give or take, that was the situation. If we have a look at the map of the year 2025, we have quite a lot of Protestant presence in countries like Spain, Portugal, or Italy, thanks to migration. People have come from places like West Africa, strengthening Protestantism, even though what they are doing and their church background is often somewhat different than the Protestants you had in these countries. You, however, have in the Nordic countries throughout the last 20, 25 years, a growing presence of Catholicism. We, for example, know that in Norway, where you had a very, very small Catholic church and one Scandinavian bishops' conference, there's been a very, very significant inflow of Polish migrant workers who have brought parts of a Polish Catholic Church with them. And I don't need to mention it here, of course, but the presence of Orthodoxy has changed significantly. First with labor migration, but also given that quite a few of the 4 or 5 million people who left Ukraine to come to Western Europe were Orthodox. And important for our hosts, of course, a lot of Western Christians, including pastors, all of a sudden discovered the existence of Greek Catholic churches. I think for a lot of them, it was an eye-opening example. So we see that the Christian geography, as I would call it, in Europe is in a move. And that can be a beautiful thing, but it can also, if it's not handled respectfully and also with enough knowledge, lead to situations where it's very, very difficult. Just to give you an example, colleagues from the Danish University in Copenhagen, Lund University in Sweden, and the Christian Council in Denmark have done studies about ecumenical hospitality towards Christians who had to leave Ukraine after 2022. And they found all kinds of reactions. I mean, most of the reactions were of goodwill, but you will have instances where, for example, a Danish pastor opened the doors for everybody coming, inviting them to Eucharist, which was a well-intended gesture, but of course, in the logic of the different churches, a highly problematic thing without those who were taking Eucharist being informed about it. And there's lots of others where I think we have seen over the last years that also within Christianity, migration is raising a number of questions. And I'll come to that in a minute. If I talk about the experiences I've made, they are mainly within the European continent. I think discussions in other parts of the world are different, even though I would argue that quite a few of the discussions and experiences in Northern America, particularly in the last 10, 15 years, have strong similarities with what is happening in Europe. Situation in the other continents is often very different. You have certain patterns in the displacement in the north of Latin America, which have also similarities, but I think the general setup is too different to really generalize on that. From the outset, it seems relatively clear. The message, I was a stranger and you welcomed me, is nothing which can be read differently from a Catholic perspective, a Protestant or an Orthodox. It's very, very clear. And you can, of course, have vast and ample theology around it, and there is a lot of theology around it, but this theology is not denominationally in any way predetermined. I think it rather depends on the context in which you are doing theology. However, if we look at dealing with and for migrants, we have different approaches due to the nature of the different churches. We have the Catholic Church, one global church. A lot of questions which you have in Protestantism, for example, do not turn up here. In a Protestant church, it's often the question, if you, for example, have somebody from Ghana coming to a Protestant church in Europe, has this person been baptized? Is it baptism of a church we recognize as such? Within a Catholic church, this is nothing you need to deal with. Other issues, like the question of how much is worship held in the native language? How much is it held in the language of the country of origin? What does that do with culture? What does it do with hospitality? Are very, very similar, independent if whether you have a global church or a couple of churches which are rather nationally. However, the way a church thinks is often very determined. And as I said, you on the one hand have the global church, the Catholic Church. You on the other hand have lots of Protestant churches who often even have the country they're in their name. We have the Church of Norway, for example. On the Orthodox side, we have the Church of Greece. So being particular and specific to one country for these churches is very, very often a constituent element of their identity. And of course, you have very, very different ways of understanding the history of the church. For example, if I look at the example of Protestantism, I have mentioned Italian Protestantism, for whom migration is an enormous opportunity. In a country where Protestantism always has been a tiny minority, all of a sudden hundreds of thousands of Protestants are coming in. So it's a very interesting thing for the survival of the church, for its role in society. If, however, talk to the Lutheran Archbishop of Estonia, his take on migration is very, very different, because migration in his context was the Russification of Estonia during the Soviet time, where those who were coming and settling in Estonia were very often those who, often through no fault of their own, but were used for oppressing the culture of Estonia, and in which, because the church was speaking Estonian in a setting which was becoming more and more Russian speaking, the church saw it as its identity to defend the identity of the nation, of the church, against those coming in. So the mental setup is a very, very different one. Last aspect I would like to mention here, and that is particularly pertinent for the migration we've seen and the displacement we've seen after 2015, maybe persons from Syria, mainly arriving in Southeastern Europe first. For a lot of the churches in this area, this evoked memories of the attacks of the Ottomans. And for me, this has always been strange. I was always saying, well, I learned in history that the Ottomans came with weapons and killing people, and the people I saw coming from Syria via Greece were coming with the bag of all their belongings on crutches because they were fleeing. But in the mental setup of a lot of people and in the narrative, it was, oh, they're coming again. So I think we need to be very, very careful about which historic associations migration raises in the specific context we have. There is, of course, an additional element. If we were in a world where there was churches alone, we were talking about it alone, things would already be complicated enough. But to make things worse, we have the political sphere. And particularly since 2015, there's more and more politicians who are coming in with the argument that they are defending Christian Europe against non-Christians. And that is a very problematic one. I find that theologically very, very problematic. And particularly one of the governments to put that narrative forward is the Hungarian government. My grandparents in 1830 had to leave Austria-Hungary because they were Protestant and they were no longer tolerated there. Had they lived under the Ottomans at that point in time and paid their taxes, nobody would have bothered them about their religion. So I think we need to be very, very careful about these narratives and to which extent they are true or to which extent they are constructed. Anyway, having said that, national history plays an enormous role on the perception of migration and how much churches see themselves as equal and people you can cooperate with, or if there's a sliding suspicion that the church might be advancing certain political goals you're not happy with. Maybe the last point I would like to mention is that we are, of course, also in times where in society the question of which role religion should still play is raised through migration. We do, in most parts of the European continent, have a slight, it's often referred to as the Christian or the Christian Judaic heritage of the continent, but the religious practice, with few exceptions, is relatively minor. And we are seeing both through people from other religions, that's people mainly coming from Muslim majority countries, but also through Christians coming from other countries, Christians who are, for example, from West Africa coming. Any opinion poll shows that there's a higher degree of religiosity and also a higher degree of articulating religious belief in the public sphere. So all of that contributes to a situation where ecumenical relations on migration are seeing a great challenge, but are also offering a great opportunity. The first area, as I've said, is the area of diaconia, social work, charitable work. And here I think there's a very, very long tradition of churches doing things ecumenically. If you visit the office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in Hungary, you will at the wall have a little picture of a little wagon, and underneath it says, reception of Hungarian refugees in Austria in 1956. These were the refugees who had to flee after the invasion of the Soviet Union. If you look closely, and I looked a bit more closely, you see that there's a little placard saying assistance by the World Council of Churches. And I think for me, this is a very, very nice picture there to see the World Council of Churches, one of the biggest ecumenical umbrella. One of the first things it did, even in the 30s and 40s before it was founded, is work together to assist people in need, people who were migrants. So I think we have throughout history, and that was all before the ecumenical movement started, really. That was all before Vatican II, and similarly, we have seen a very vivid cooperation of churches whenever there was a need. And what I see from the things happening in the different countries across Europe, it is very often that you have the welfare organization of the Catholic Church, and that's usually the Caritas, and be it either an Orthodox or a Protestant organization, trying to work hand in hand. And often that will mean joint appeals. For example, in Poland, very predominantly Catholic country, but there's a joint Christmas initiative of the Orthodox Church together with the diaconie of the Lutheran Church and of the Caritas to sell candles. And they come in a set, and you can buy one with only the Caritas or one with only diaconie. But that's a practical thing, and everybody wants to have three of them, to have the whole set of all the different denominations. So that is a very, very small thing, but it's a major fundraiser for the churches, and it allows them to show together that despite situations which are probably, if you talk about church politics, not always very easy, it is in the service aspect very, very possible and very, very helpful to work together. And what we see in more and more places as well is that the churches in their service are cooperating in a scenery which is increasingly secular, where the question about why do churches run refugee support centers, for example, is very much there, because there's always this theory or this suspicion, oh, they might be proselytizing. And I think all the Christian organizations I know across Europe who are related to the major churches say, no, we deliver service. We are not trying to proselytize. We keep the service we have and our Christian conviction apart, in the sense that we don't want to convince anybody because we're helping them. If they like us and want to come, that's a different question. But I think there's not this proselytizing, but there is from the outset increasingly the question, why do Christians help people coming here? Is it their own interest or not? And I think in that context, it is very, very good that churches can stand together and articulate that, no, that the love of Christ calls us to help people, but it doesn't call us to help people so that they might join, that there's a different logic there. And we're also increasingly in some countries seeing that there's some basis for an interfaith cooperation, that churches are getting together, but that, for example, Jewish organizations, which have in the last years played a very important role in the displacement from Ukraine, are getting their act together and often trying to link up with Christian initiatives. What we have also seen is that churches often find that they're not able to do all areas. For example, in refugee support, not do psychological and legal advice and housing and others, and then compare notes and see what can be done together. So in the sense that the Caritas would, for example, do the psychological counseling, and the Protestant welfare organization would be doing the legal, would be doing other aspects, like, for example, the housing. There's often a cooperation where that can go on. And very, very often, the leadership in opinion is also very, very essential. A picture, I'm German, I remember from 2015, that when some of the trains from Hungary passing through Austria were arriving in Germany in the Munich railway station, Cardinal Marx of Munich at that time and the Bavarian Protestant Lutheran Bishop Heinrich Bedford Strom together stood at the railway station welcoming people, sending out a strong, strong signal of the churches standing together in the service of those who are arriving based on common convictions. This goes over to a number of very practical cooperation. I have mentioned already that CCME has a strong membership from the National Council of Churches. And of course, national councils of churches don't only work on migration question, but my impression is that very, very often the working together on migration questions is a very, very strong area where they feel that working together is beneficial, where they feel that the work undertaken together is an excellent witness for the common calling. You may, and I'm caricaturing now, but I know a lot of council of churches where you have a theological commission and they're still debating things of 500 years ago, whereas the migration commission is writing common papers and jointly going to talk to government about how it should be treating refugees and migrants and what the ongoing legal debate should look like. And that is the second area. There's on top of the very, very good cooperation in many places on practical things, the representation towards authorities. And we know in my last lecture on Friday, talked a lot about how legislation is going at the moment and that a lot of legislation is not going into the right direction. And there you see in many places churches together trying to appeal to government. You may be aware that the Finnish government has about a year ago on the number of an assumed inflow of many, many asylum-seeking persons closed the border. And in debate, which is very, very hostile, it was the churches who together in a joint statement of all the leaders of the churches say, no, this is not the policy we want. This is not what we think our Christian heritage tells us to do towards people who arrive seeking protections. And yes, we are as churches not naive. We are aware that the Russian Federation, with whom we share this long, long border, is trying to use these people, but it should not be the people who are coming here who are suffering from it. So that was very important. Similarly, a couple of weeks before the elections in Germany in February, the center-right party, the Christian Democrats, which traditionally has a good connection to Christian churches, decided to have a vote on a migration resolution together with the extreme right, I would say fascist party, AfD. And there was big shock. And one of the things which was most noticed in the debate was that the two big churches, the Roman Catholic Church as well as the Protestant churches, in a joint letter to the members of the German parliament had written, please don't do that, you're crossing a line. It was noted as the letter of urgency and warning sent by the churches. And that is an experience, this expression of the churches, which I also share on the Brussels level. We very, very often in debates on asylum, on migration, with authorities, with members of parliament, others, we have 5 minutes to present the position. We can't afford to spend the first 3.5 minutes on explaining which church we represent and which community we represent and which one not. We try to go in there and say, Christians and Christian churches think this. And that is something where in the scenery which we have in Brussels here, where we have around 60 civil society organizations working one way or the other on asylum migration questions, everybody knows the Christian group. The question often is when we're discussing who does what and who has the debate, is the Christian group doing anything on that? So I have a lot of colleagues from secular organizations like Amnesty International or others with whom I've worked for years, and they still have a very vague idea whom I really work for. They often ask me about what the Pope thinks, and I say, well, different organization, but never mind. And then they congratulate the colleagues of the ICMC, the International Catholic Migration Commission, on work we do, and vice versa. But for me, this is actually quite a nice thing, that they're seeing that the churches are doing similarly together and they're having one positions together. And I think it also helps us to try to move as much as possible, to move as much in the political discussion as possible. And we're trying to make an effort to include others. There's, for example, the evangelical movement, and on a number of issues, I would theologically disagree with some of their teaching. But in the questions of asylum migration, they came at a point and asked, can we be part of the discussions because we feel we have lots of common? And for me, it was very, very clear, yeah, we should do that. Everything we can say together, we should say together. And I mean, this is a bit characterized by the wish to do as much as possible together. That also means we don't discuss certain things and we don't articulate ourselves on certain things. My famous example is in whatever we discuss, we always very much underline the importance of family and family unity. We have, however, in the Christian group never defined what constitutes a family, knowing fully well that that would be a major bone of contention between the different traditions in the church. And that is a widely respected position. We know also a few other things where we say, we don't do that. we know from our particular organizational point, we would like to insist on that, but it would be at the detriment of our unity. So we rather try to keep the unity and speak with one voice than move forward together, than moving forward together only on our own. And I think that is something which is widely respected and recognized. I have mentioned last time around that the question to which extent churches are still really seriously hurt by those in decision-making positions is a difficult one, but at least we try to do this together. And I'm always saying, well, yes, churches are no longer as big as they were. We're all losing members, but we're still the biggest association in each country, maybe except for the National Football Association. But to say here the churches are still a force to be reckoned with. And churches, and that gets me also back to the question of social support. If we talk about the Greek islands or the borderland between North Macedonia and Greece, if we talk about the area between Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia, if we talk about the northern Finnish border with Russia, it's very often you'll find migrants, refugees stranded in places where there's no town hall, no post office, not a pub, but quite often a church. So to say together, if we use our power and our networks together, we can do a lot of things a lot of other organizations can't do. And I think in that spirit, it's very, very important that we keep these things together. And as I said, it's good practice to do that together. And I've never, in the now more than 20 years I've worked for CCME in the cooperation within our membership with the different church denominations and with Roman Catholic organizations, I've never seen a point where a denominational perspective was divisive. It is rather often that you have certain expressions of the church that, for example, our minority member, the Italian Protestants, might see themselves more as an activist NGO and that way compare quite nicely to the Caritas in Sweden, whereas the old former state church of Sweden, Lutheran Church, has a lot together with the bishops' conferences in Italy as the big minority church who somehow always has found itself that it's supporting the government. So it's more the social structure of different organizations in our different memberships than the denominational background, which sometimes leads to certain misunderstandings and disagreements. But we've always been able to overcome that. And the third point I would like to come to, and that gets back to the points of what I call the denominational geography of Europe, is really how do we deal with migration in the midst of our churches? And as I said, one of the first things there is that I'm happy that when people from another Christian church appear somewhere as migrants, it nowadays in the majority of parishes is the reaction to say, can we offer a space? Can we welcome you in our worship service? Having said that, as long as the churches are at least doctrinally still so divided that there's no common place at the altar of the Lord, we need to treat that with a bit of care. And there's a couple of anecdotal things which probably illustrate that. I'm getting back to the Danish example because the colleagues there have done some really interesting research between the Danish Lutheran Church itself, the so-called folk church there, and the university. And one of the interesting things is that they did a case study on Romanian migrant workers, discovering that there was a rather well-to-do middle class emerging from the Romanian migrant workers who had settled in Denmark, who were having their own churches and spiritual life and everything. But interestingly enough, the children who had grown up in Denmark at the age of 13, 14, and they'd been growing up as Orthodox and been going to the Orthodox Church, a vast number of them went to the Protestant confirmation, because that's the rite of passage. That's the thing you do when you're 13 or 14 in Denmark. And the churches there are having a very interesting discussion how to deal with it, because nobody wants to tell these youngsters you shouldn't be doing that. But of course, if you have an understanding, you're a member of the Orthodox Church, and then you get confirmed in the Protestant Church, you have a bit of a difficulty if you look at it from a church law perspective. And there are many, many other things. And I think there's a number of encouraging examples which go back to the 1960s. As I mentioned, the Church's Commission for Migrants in Europe was founded in 1964. At that time, as a response of churches to the inner European migration. But that, for example, meant that in the context of CCME, but also other fora, for example, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Protestant Church in Germany, and also around the corner, then the Catholic Bishops' Conference in Germany, have come to some understanding what you do with an interdenominational marriage, where in a lot of other countries where that practice of living so diversely one another has not yet emerged. So I think there's a lot of pastoral issues which come out of it. And I've mentioned the issue of using the church, but there's also, of course, the question of the clergy. And here we have a very interesting debate. We have the normal societal integration debate, which basically says if somebody comes in as a migrant, he or she should preferably go into the clubs, into the schools, into all the other social entities which already exist. Now, what does that tell us? If somebody is coming from, say, a Bulgarian background, going up there as an Orthodox, and all of a sudden lands in Belgium, does that mean this person should go to the Catholic Church because it's the minority church, the majority church? Probably not. Does it mean this person would, as he or she is an Orthodox in a non-Orthodox country, in a diaspora country, go to the Church of the Ecumenical Patriarchate? Or does it mean, as we're seeing it here in Brussels, that the Bulgarian Orthodox Church all of a sudden opens its doors here in a Roman Catholic church building? So you see, there's lots of questions which we need to deal with very, very sensitively, and where, as I mentioned, the example from reception of Ukrainians after 2022 in the churches in Northern Europe, a lot of ignorance can be a terrible pitfall here. If you have never really encountered a non-Lutheran church in depth, for example, when you're a Danish priest, your reaction might be, okay, everybody come in and participate, and this way we show you what you're doing, that you're most welcome. So the best intention might here lead to certain difficulties. And once again, I would argue that generally speaking, the Catholic Church has an enormous advantage here as a global church. But from what I understand from different places, the expression, for example, of Nordic Catholicism traditionally, and the expression of the Catholicism Polish migrant workers brought along, has been posing a number of very, very important challenges, because the theology, the way of doing worship, the way of interacting in the parish, and the way of dealing with hierarchy was very, very different. And this is an interesting discussion where I think what we've described as the joint commitment in social work, diaconia, joint commitment in public witness, should encourage us to take one step further in discussing it as a question of Christian relations, ecumenical relations, maybe at some point even ecclesiology. Often here, I also think that finding practical ways of dealing with it, going as far as it's possible but not beyond, will be very, very important. And I think that is also something a lot of Protestant churches are learning, that if you are a church which is a national church but understands itself as one which is open to the world, you need to change in certain things. We know that Christianity, Protestant Christianity outside Europe, is much more colorful than what we have usually here in Europe. We know that it involves the whole body. It is not just like an ordinary European Protestant church that you sit there, that you have a sermon for 30 minutes, you sing a hymn, and then you're done. So the whole question of how you do liturgy is within the different streams of Christianity, Catholicism, Protestantism, Orthodox, very, very much a debate, but also in the relations. And to make things even more confusing, if we look at expression of non-European Christianity, we'll often find churches which do not really fit in. Once again, an example from a mainly Protestant background. I have for a number of years been working in the advisory group of the Community of Protestant Churches in Europe. That is basically Reformed Lutheran churches, United Churches, Methodists, and others, who have in the year 1972 come to an agreement in which they say that all the differences they had in 1500 and a bit are no longer so relevant, that they recognize one another in baptism, Eucharist ministry. So it's in this sense an inner Protestant ecumenism. So far, so good. 6 years ago, one of the CCME members, the Church of the Cherubim and Seraphim, asked for membership in the Community of Protestant Churches in Europe, because they said, we are in Europe, we are Protestant, we want to belong. Now, I don't know if you know this church, just to say it's been founded exactly 100 years ago, at that time in Nigeria. It is a prospering church. It is colloquially often referred to as a white gown church, because a lot of the worships is with choirs and clergy in white garment. And through migration, mainly of Nigerians to other countries, they have now a presence in Europe, mainly in the UK, but also in other countries. So this group was clearly saying, we are here in Europe, we want to belong to European Christianity. Something which, if you talk about integration, everybody should say, wonderful, please, please, please come. However, somebody says, yeah, he's Nigerian, he understands my point. Thank you very much. So if you have a church which is 100 years old, and you say, in order to become member of our fellowship of Protestants in Europe, you need to sign certain statements on things which happened 500 years ago, you can see how much of a difficulty we have here. And I think if we are discussing these questions, and I'm using the example from Protestantism because I was directly encountering it, but I think they're rather similar stories from global Christianity in other denominations. I think we need to rethink some of that traditional ecumenical paradigm where we talk about the different pillars, which basically have been decided in 1054 or 1517 and the following. So I think global Christianity is challenging us to see, can we go a step further in Europe? And it is a Christianity which I'm always impressed in many, many places is a much more vibrant Christianity than the one we have had over the last 100 years in Europe here. So I think there is, for example, in the area of mission and connecting witness in society also with a clear mission, quite a bit we can learn. Having said that, let's not idealize it. There's also in the new churches, new Christian expressions, quite often competitions. You have some leaders who are not always the best, but I think this is something we should look a bit more carefully. And in that sense, we might have a completely new ecumenical conversation. I recognize that I've talked for 40 minutes now, so I'll slowly come to my end. But just to say, I think migration is challenging societies as a whole. It is challenging us as churches to think anew. And I would recommend, at least in the area of diaconia, in the area of joint public witness and advocacy, we no longer need to ask, shall we do that together? But we need to justify ourselves if we're not doing it together. And in the area of classical ecumenical relations, migration highlighting the scandal of divided Christianity, we need to see how we can use that as a productive force to understand one another better. And I still think we need to learn more about one another, and then seeing where we can move forward. In that sense, I'll be very, very happy to hear your questions.